What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
When my phone buzzed under my palm as I took those first steps toward the aisle and I saw the text that said, "We are outside. Can we see you?" I felt a wave that was not nerves and not joy but something old and sharp rising from a place I thought I had finally learned to seal. And while the room around me went quiet the way people do when they know something big is unfolding, my head went straight back to the day my sister decided to set a match to my life and then smile while everyone watched me burn. Because if you have ever been betrayed by your own blood, you know that the body keeps the timeline even when the calendar moves on. And in that heartbeat, I was not a bride. I was a daughter on the front porch being told to leave. Amanda had always understood the weak spots in our family, the buttons you could press to get dad stubborn and mom fearful, and she got very comfortable pressing them whenever it meant the spotlight shifted her way. So by the time I was in the last stretch of high school, she had already learned that a lie, if delivered with tears and a wounded tone, could outrun the truth by a mile. And I was busy trying to keep my grades steady and my head clear because I knew college was my only door out, which apparently made me a very convenient target. She started with whispers that I was sleeping around, the kind of rumor that makes every hallway look longer and every group chat go silent when you walk in. And when that did not move me out of the path she needed for herself, she went bigger and nastier and told our parents I was selling pills, which was ridiculous because I could barely afford a coffee most days. But ridiculous does not matter when fear enters the room, and she played fear. Like a piano. The night it all blew up, Amanda stood off to the side with her arms crossed, letting mom do the crying and dad do the talking, and I remember trying to explain, not begging, just laying out facts the way a calm person lays out bills on a table. Except facts do not land when someone is already picturing police cars and ruined futures. So dad went into that clipped voice that meant a decision had been made, and he told me I had until morning to get out, and mom handed me a small stack of cash. That felt like a tip and asked me to think about what I had done, which really meant confess, which really meant take the story that was handed to you and wear it. I slept maybe an hour at my friend Jess's place on a borrowed pillow, and I stared at the ceiling thinking about how it takes years to build a reputation and one sentence to torch it, and somewhere around dawn, when the fear started to thin out and the anger got a little voice of its own, I realized I could not make them believe me. By talking, I had to let them trip over the truth on their own. Amanda is careless when she is winning, and that is the thing you wait for if you know a person like her, because when they think the game is over they stop locking doors, and that week I remembered something small but useful, which is that the old tablet in the kitchen was still tied to the family accounts even after Amanda grabbed it for herself a while back, and she had used it to message friends from time to time because she liked the bigger screen. Jess's brother showed me how to pull up the backup history with nothing more than the shared login that had not been changed since middle school, and I sat there with my heart pounding in my ears, and I read messages where my sister bragged about planting a bag in my backpack, complained that I never react the way she expects, and joked about how the counselor would believe anything if she got a certain classmate to cry on cue, plus a lovely thread about study helpers that sounded a lot less like tutoring and a lot more like being the middle person for kids who wanted to stay up through exams, and I did not need to print anything dramatic or wave it under anyone's nose because attention is a currency, and I wanted to spend mine wisely. So I took screenshots, cleaned the metadata the way Jess's brother showed me, and I sent them, not to my parents who had already judged and sentenced me, but to two people who actually monitor behavior that affects other students. The school nurse who had been chasing rumors about stimulant swaps for months, and the cheer coach who took code of conduct very seriously when homecoming was around the corner. I did not sign my name. I did not include a speech. I simply put the relevant pieces together so that an adult who was not related to me could connect them without me in the room. And then I put my phone down and went to my shift because rent does not care about your heartbreak. By the end of the week, which felt like a lifetime and a half, Amanda was pulled from a leadership role with a bland announcement about standards. The counselor started asking real questions about a circle of kids that had looked squeaky clean until someone turned on the light, and my parents, who heard it secondhand from a neighbor because they always do, did not call to apologize or ask if I was okay. They called to accuse me of trying to ruin my sister's future, which told me everything I needed to know about where the lines were drawn, and I let the call go to voicemail because a boundary is still a boundary even when your stomach turns. I would love to say that first small win made me feel triumphant, but what it actually did was flip a switch in my head that said, you are not powerless, you can be strategic, you can stop standing in the middle of fires you did not light. And while Amanda ranted in messages that I blocked, I started documenting everything, dates and names and little timelines that make sense later when people try to pretend they do not remember, and I told myself that I was going to build a life so sturdy that her lies would bounce off it like rubber balls, and that when she came for me again, because people like her always do, I would not argue, I would show, I would choose the moment, and I would make it count. When I say I started over, I do not mean some glossy reset where a new apartment appears and life politely lines up. I mean the kind of start that begins on a friend's couch where you fold your hoodie as a pillow and you tell yourself that tomorrow you will figure out the next step because tonight you just need to keep your head above the water. And while Amanda kept performing her pity act for anyone who would listen, I learned how to hold a job that smelled like bleach in the morning and a second one that smelled like burnt coffee at night. I learned to stretch tips into groceries, and I learned that silence can be a skill when talking to the wrong people only reloads their favorite story about you. So I kept my mouth shut and my receipts organized and my eyes on the one lifeline that still made sense, which was getting into a college far enough away that my last name would not enter the room before I did. The rumor mill did not slow down just because I stopped feeding it, since Amanda loved to say that I was spiraling and that the family had done everything they could, and she selected phrases that landed well with adults who felt important when they repeated them. So I became the cautionary tale in little conversations I was not invited to, and the teacher who once praised my essays now smiled a little too tightly like she had been told to watch out, while the counselor who might have helped me find emergency aid was suddenly very busy, which meant I had to become my own counselor and my own reference and my own grant writer, and if that sounds exhausting, that is because it was. Yet there's a strange clarity that shows up when you realize that nobody is coming and it is on you to build the door. So I took the test dates, I filled out the forms. And I worked shifts so long that I would count quarters in my pockets and think about tuition in the same breath. I kept hearing Amanda's favorite lines boomerang back to me through people who did not realize I could still hear. Things about me sleeping with this person and selling that thing, and the way she wrapped it all in fake concern made me want to scream. But I had already learned that yelling is just free advertising for a liar, so I waited for her to get sloppy again, and of course she did, because she never does the boring work of covering her tracks, and I kept remembering how she loved to run her mouth about volunteer hours and community leadership, especially that little nonprofit tutoring project she had created for her application essays, where she claimed to have logged a heroic number of hours mentoring kids. Which sounded lovely unless you knew she spent most afternoons in a car with friends pretending to be busy, and the sign-in sheets she bragged about were the kind of thing you can fabricate when you know the right adult will not double-check. Jess's brother, who enjoys the kind of harmless hacking that companies pay for when they call it auditing, showed me how the public page for Amanda's project had backdated posts and recycled photos. And he pointed out metadata that said the same picture of the same child had been uploaded 3 times across 3 months with 3 different captions, which was sloppy and also peak Amanda. So I collected it gently and quietly the way you gather sharp pieces, so no one gets cut until you decide it is time, and I thought carefully about where the truth would matter instead of where it would merely start a new fight. Then I sent a neat packet of screenshots with the file details visible and the timelines spelled out to the Community Grant Committee that had listed her group as a semi-finalist and to the guidance office that signs off on service awards. And I did not attach a speech or a signature or a threat. I only attached the facts and the dates and let those do the talking because facts are stubborn when you pin them down. Within a week, which felt both fast and perfectly timed, the committee posted a neutral note that their semi-finalists had been updated after routine verification, and Amanda's project quietly disappeared from the page like it had never been there. while the guidance office sent a bland email reminding all students that documentation must be verifiable and that any discrepancies would affect eligibility, which was a nice way of saying that someone got caught without saying who, and it traveled through the hallways without my name attached, and for the first time since that awful night I felt not triumph exactly, but a clean click in my chest, the feeling of a door you installed yourself closing on a draft you have been living with for too long. And when Amanda messaged me a performative paragraph about how jealous girls destroy good things, I did not reply. I just took a breath and went to work because rent still did not care about my personal victories. The house I used to live in did not call to apologize and the counselor did not offer to revisit anything, but small justice has a way of adjusting your spine, and I walked into the test center with a steadier hand. I walked into the coffee shop with a firmer voice when customers tried to talk to me like I was invisible. And I walked into the library with a notebook where I wrote the names of scholarships that did not require a parent's tax forms or a recommendation from a person who thought I was a problem. Then I wrote essays that told the truth without asking for pity, and I sent them off like paper boats, not knowing which ones would make it to shore. The letter that mattered most arrived on a weekday when I was trying to fix a stain on my one decent pair of work pants, and I opened it with that bracing feeling you get before a shot. Then I read the words that said yes, and I sat on the edge of the sink and laughed in a way that sounded like a cough, because I had held my breath for so long. And when the joy calmed down, I reached the part with the numbers that were not small and the deadlines that were not generous, and I felt that old sharp thing rise again. The one that says you are going to have to outthink this, because nobody is writing a check for you. And as I folded the letter and put it into a plastic sleeve like it was a fragile photograph, my phone buzzed with a notification from the school account reminding me that the Service Awards assembly was that evening, which meant I would get to watch Amanda smile through a ceremony that had just lost the one title she really needed. And I realized I had delivered the second blow without saying a word, but the real question sat in front of me like a bill I could not ignore, which was how I would actually pay for the future I had just scraped my way into. Getting into college felt like landing on a tiny patch of solid ground after swimming for far too long, and the moment I stopped laughing at the acceptance letter and started reading the numbers that could swallow me whole, I realized that if I wanted this to work, I would have to treat every day like a little negotiation where I traded time and energy for opportunities that other people were handed without asking. So I sat in the financial aid office with a polite voice and a folder full of applications, and I wrote essays late at night that did not ask for pity but laid out effort in plain language, and I stacked together a resident advisor position that covered housing, a work-study job in a quiet office that paid by the hour, and a handful of small scholarships from groups that cared more about persistence than pedigree, which meant that I could register for classes without holding my breath and could buy used textbooks without doing mental math that made my stomach hurt. College did not make the rumors die, it only changed the distance they traveled, because Amanda discovered that social media could carry her favorite story into rooms I had never entered. And while I learned how to speak in seminars without apologizing for existing, I also learned that lies grow when you feed them attention and shrink when you starve them of oxygen. So I did not confront her in comments, and I did not write speeches about forgiveness. I simply documented patterns and kept my circle tight and pushed my energy into assignments and shifts, and although there were nights when the noise got inside my head and I lay awake listing out the things I could not fix, something steadier began to grow underneath. A kind of muscle that forms when you keep showing up for yourself, and I promised that if I ever got the chance to tilt the field back to level, I would take it without blinking. The chance arrived the way chances often do, not with a grand announcement, but with a tiny tell mixed into ordinary life. Because during winter break I went back to Jess's place to save money, and I used the old family laptop that I had bought for myself years ago, but left behind in the chaos. And when I opened a folder labeled drafts, I found a personal statement that read like mine, except it was not mine. It was Amanda's application for a competitive fellowship at a regional leadership program. And line after line marched by with my phrasing and my structure and even the little rhythm I use when I am trying to sound calm and firm at the same time, and since I still had my original essays saved with timestamps inside a cloud account and in emails to professors, The timeline was not just clear, it was undeniable, so I did not send a long letter and I did not beg anyone to believe me. I simply collected the side-by-side paragraphs with dates visible, attached a short note that said I believed a submission might contain unattributed material drawn from my work, and forwarded it to the program director and to the academic integrity office that partners with them. Then I closed the laptop and went to my shift. Because nothing accelerates time like a decision you cannot take back. The response took less than a week and arrived with the kind of formal language that tries not to sound like judgment. A message thanking me for the documentation and informing me that the applicant in question would no longer be under consideration and that guardians had been notified according to policy, and I read the note twice. Once as the girl who had been called a problem and once as the woman who had just held a line without yelling, and, while part of me wanted to forward it to my parents with a subject that said told you so, a louder part knew that silence, in the right moment, feels better than applause, so I tucked the email away and went on with my day. And when Jess later mentioned that Amanda's boyfriend had posted something vague about people who cannot win fair, I just smiled into my coffee and let the quiet do its work. School moved forward the way life does when you stop asking it to apologize, and I found professors who noticed the way I prepared and managers who noticed the way I solved problems before they became someone else's emergency. And by the time I was deep into my junior year, I had a patchwork that actually felt stable, with resident advisor duty that sharpened my patience, office hours that paid for groceries, and a semester-long internship at a small communications firm downtown where I learned that influence is mostly logistics and that people are remarkably predictable when you track incentives instead of vibes, and I kept putting one foot in front of the other, telling myself that maybe the best revenge was not just surviving, but becoming so confident that nobody could reduce me to a rumor and keep a straight face. Amanda did not fade from the story so much as drift into it at odd angles, because every few months another soft lie would surface, another insinuation would find its way into the inbox of someone who had just started to like me. And if I had not grown the muscle, I would have gone under from sheer exhaustion, but by then I had learned to treat slander the way you treat spam, which is to filter ruthlessly and respond only when there is value. And one afternoon that value finally presented itself. When a classmate forwarded me a screenshot of a group chat where Amanda was riffing about how she had switched a paragraph here and a paragraph there for multiple applications, and how easy it was to recycle a sad family story if you swapped the names. And the chat was not public, but it was populated by people who thought the rules did not apply, and one of them, perhaps bored or perhaps decent, sent it along with the timestamps intact, and I recognized a pattern that would matter to the right office far more than it would matter in a comment thread. I compiled the screenshots, attached the relevant application links that were still cached, and sent the packet to a regional honor society that had been featuring Amanda's quotes about leadership. Using the same calm tone and the same preference for verifiable detail that had worked before, and a month later, without naming anyone, they posted a note about rescinding a pending induction due to irregularities and reviewing their vetting process, which was bureaucratic, for we saw enough to act. And we are closing the door, and while that move did not fix my family, it did something even better for me. It proved that I could tilt the field back to level one careful inch at a time, and that the person who had tried to paint me as reckless had a hard time keeping her own hands clean when someone finally turned on the lights. The internship turned into a part-time role for my final semester, and then, after a presentation where I handled a skeptical client without getting defensive, into a full-time offer that came with a salary and a calendar and a badge. And the morning I walked in as a real employee and opened my new inbox, the first internal memo I saw listed accounts for the quarter, and halfway down the page sat a client name tied to a community program in the very county where I grew up, with a note about a quiet reputation issue around inflated service claims and scholarship endorsements that might not stand up to scrutiny, and under the account team my name appeared in plain text, which meant I had been assigned without anyone knowing history. And as I stared at the screen and felt that familiar old sharpness rise and then steady into something colder and clearer, I realized that the story was about to circle back in a way that would let me use every skill I had learned without breaking a single rule, and when I clicked accept on the calendar invite for the kickoff and closed my laptop with a careful hand, I knew that the next move would be mine and that I was very ready to make it count. The first week after I signed the full-time offer felt like walking into a room where everyone assumed I already belonged, and while that sounds flattering, it also meant I had to keep my balance. Because the client list waiting in my inbox did not care about my backstory or my family, it cared about deliverables and reputations, and whether I could look at a messy situation without flinching. Which is exactly what happened when I opened the memo about a regional community program in my home county that was wrestling with nagging questions about inflated service claims, recycled scholarship endorsements, and a speaker slate that seemed to feature the same small circle of young leaders who always knew how to be photographed with a giant check. And as my eyes moved line by line, I felt the past sit up and stretch, because threaded through those names and testimonials was the same network that had propped up Amanda's imagined greatness for years, except now the examination would be professional, documented, and accountable to a board that cared about facts more than tears. I told myself that if I did this with a clean process, there would be nothing for anyone to throw back at me, so I built a plan that would look boring to anyone who enjoys drama and perfect to any auditor who enjoys clarity, which meant cross-checking posted volunteer totals against actual program rosters, checking whether the same two adults had signed off on a suspicious number of awards, scanning social posts for backdated uploads or repeated images with new captions, and asking for the email headers that show when files were created rather than when they were announced. And I added a simple conflict of interest step that most people skip, which is to map who sits on which committee and who is dating or mentoring whom. Because you would be amazed how often the loudest voice also wrote the recommendation letter and also managed the tally sheet. The findings arrived the way truth usually arrives, not as a single explosion, but as a set of patterns that refuse to go away, because the largest youth leadership cohort had service logs with identical handwriting across different schools. The scholarship page listed endorsements with matching phrasing down to the comma, and the Star Volunteer Project that kept showing up in county newsletters turned out to have a website built on a free template with upload times that did not match the story. And threaded through those pieces were Amanda's quotes and Amanda's headshots and Amanda's old brand name from the tutoring project that had vanished the year I asked questions, which meant that the problem was not my family drama. It was a system that rewarded surface and punished verification. I wrote the diligence memo like a person who never expected a second chance at being believed. Plain paragraphs that linked each claim to a source, screenshots labeled with timestamps, a table that listed committee overlaps, and a short recommendation section that suggested pausing endorsements until independent verification could be completed, replacing self-reported hours with third-party check-ins, rotating committee members so the same two people could not sign every certificate, and publishing a simple accountability page so the community could track who gets what and why. And when my manager asked whether I anticipated pushback, I said yes, because guarding a gate tends to make the people who once breezed through it very angry. And he laughed in that careful corporate way and told me to bring the board something they could actually vote on. The board meeting ran long in the way meetings run long when people realize they have been asleep at the wheel, and when the chair finally put the recommendations on the table, the vote moved faster than I expected, with a unanimous pause on endorsements, an immediate audit of the last cycle of awards, and a polite but firm note to the event committee about avoiding invite lists that look like family group chats, and the next morning the public page changed with neutral language about improved standards and a revised speaker lineup for a leadership breakfast, which would have been routine if not for the name that disappeared quietly from the program. Because Amanda's photo and bio blinked out without ceremony and the event posted a bland line about schedule adjustments, and I stood at my desk with my hands still and felt something in my chest settle, not because a microphone had been yanked out of her hand, but because the rules had finally been applied evenly and she had nowhere to hide behind the soft focus. Amanda did what she always does, which is to post something vague about jealousy and small minds, to call friends who would repeat her lines back to her like a chorus, and to message me indirectly through relatives who enjoy stirring the pot. And I did what I promised myself I would do, which is to stay quiet and let process do the talking, because the sweetest part of this particular payback was that nobody in the room needed my last name to do their job. They needed documentation and a spine. And for once the grown-ups provided both, and if you are waiting for me to say I felt guilty, then you do not know what it is like to lose your name and earn it back the slow way, because what I felt was relief and an electric sense of fairness clicking into place. The kind of relief that makes you sleep through the night even when your phone lights up with rants you will not read. That stretch of months turned into a hinge for my life, because the client renewed. My team trusted me with bigger problems. And in the middle of all of that, I met Daniel through a colleague who insisted we would get along because we both had a habit of taking chaos and giving it a calendar, which is not romantic to anyone else, but felt exactly right to me. And for the first time in a long time, I had a home that did not hum with dread, a job where the ground held, and a relationship that did not ask me to make myself smaller to fit someone else's story, and I started to plan a wedding with a level of calm that would have surprised the version of me who used to measure days in survival tasks. My parents did not call during any of this, which tells you how deep their silence went, but county gossip has strong legs, and eventually a cousin who enjoys announcements let it slip that my name had been on the committee memo that changed the program rules. And a few weeks after that, my aunt let another thing slip, that my parents had decided they would attend the wedding whether they were invited or not, because family is family, which is an interesting phrase from people who once handed me a stack of small bills and told me to go figure out my life, and as the date approached I tightened my guest list, briefed the venue about boundaries without using dramatic words, and thought through the difference between bitterness and closure. And on the morning I put on my ring and checked my vows, I told myself that I could hold the line one more time if I had to. Then I picked up my bouquet, and my phone vibrated with a message that said, "We are outside. Can we see you?" And all the years between the porch and that aisle collapsed into a single breath while I decided what to do next. When the phone vibrated in my palm as the music shifted and I prepared to walk those final steps toward the aisle, I glanced down at the screen and read the words that felt like a ghost dragging its nails across my chest, because the message said, "We are outside. Can we see you?" And it was signed with the names of the very parents who had once stood firm in their decision to push me out of their home with nothing more than a handful of bills and a door closing behind me. And in that moment, while the guests around me waited with bright faces and Daniel stood at the end of the aisle looking like the steady future I had built with my own two hands, I felt the past slam against the present, forcing me to choose between opening a door that had been nailed shut years ago or keeping it sealed even as the people who hurt me tried to slip back inside on a day they thought might make me weak. It is impossible to explain the way every memory layered itself in those few seconds, how my mind replayed the night Amanda smirked while spinning her lies, how my father's clipped voice told me to pack and leave, how my mother pressed cash into my palm as if that erased her silence, and how the years after were spent proving to strangers that I was not what my own family claimed, and then building a life where every degree, every paycheck, and every piece of happiness was earned without their help. And now, as I stood at the threshold of what should have been the cleanest joy of my life, they wanted to arrive unannounced and claim the role of family again, as though everything between exile and this aisle could be swept under a rug with a single hug in a church vestibule. Part of me, the part that still carries a daughter's hunger for recognition, wondered if opening that door might finally bring the apology I had spent years fantasizing about, the words that would say, "We see you, we were wrong, and we want to know you again." But another part, the sharper one forged from every insult and every cold night counting change to cover rent, reminded me that apologies delivered only when your success makes you too visible to ignore are not apologies at all but negotiations, and that letting them back inside would mean teaching them that they could banish me when I was small and claim me when I was tall, and I was no longer willing to play a piece on their board. I slipped the phone into the hand of the coordinator standing beside me, a woman who had already been briefed that uninvited guests might appear, and I told her calmly that under no circumstances should those people be allowed past the doors. And I turned my attention back to the aisle, because this was my moment and I refused to let the past drag its chains across it. And as the coordinator nodded and walked toward the entrance, I felt the knot in my stomach loosen, not because the problem was gone, but because I had finally answered the question that had lived inside me for years. If they came back, what would I do? And the answer, it turned out, was simple: I would not let them in. Walking forward toward Daniel, I felt stronger than I expected, because every step was not just about joining my life with his, but about marking a boundary in full view of everyone who mattered. Showing that family is not defined by shared blood or last names, but by who stands beside you when the lights are harsh and the nights are long. And as my hand slid into his, I thought about the people sitting behind us, the friends who opened couches to me, the mentors who believed my work when others believed lies, the colleagues who treated my diligence as value instead of suspicion, and I realized that these were the people who earned the right to witness my vows, not the ones standing outside hoping that my success might erase their choices. Later, as the reception buzzed and laughter filled the room, I learned from the coordinator that my parents had lingered outside for nearly an hour, waiting for me to send a text or step outside, and when no message came, they eventually left, still wrapped in the belief that time and silence would do the work an apology should have done. And I did not chase after them. I did not soften, because I understood that the final act of revenge, the most satisfying one of all, was not yelling or exposing them in front of others. It was letting them feel the full weight of exclusion they once forced on me. Except this time it was their choice to walk away empty-handed while I built a future without them. When the night ended and Daniel and I drove off into the next chapter of our lives, I thought about whether shutting them out forever was harsh, whether one day I would regret not giving them the chance to speak, and maybe time will complicate those feelings. Maybe one day I will look back and wonder about the what-ifs, but right now the only truth that matters is that I won by living, by building, by protecting the life they tried to deny me, and by choosing, on the single most important day of my adulthood, to leave them outside the same way they once left me, except this time the choice was mine, and I finally felt the satisfaction of knowing that justice, however messy, had landed squarely in my hands. And as we drove away into the night, I did not look back at the venue or wonder whether they were still standing there, because I knew the past had been waiting outside the whole time, and for the first time in my life I had shut the door on it, firmly, permanently, and without apology.